America has the largest national debt in human history. Today, it exceeds $39 trillion, and it continues to grow. Every year, the U.S. government spends more money than it collects in taxes. To make up the difference, it borrows. Why can the United States keep borrowing trillions of dollars without going bankrupt? The answer is that the national debt doesn't work the way most people think it does. The U.S. government doesn't save money to pay off its debt all at once. Instead, it continuously replaces old debt with new debt, while investors continue lending it more money. That system has worked for decades. It has helped finance wars, recessions, financial crises, and massive government spending. But it works only as long as investors continue believing that the United States can repay what it owes. That confidence is the foundation of the entire system. So the real question isn't whether America has debt. The real question is whether America can continue managing that debt without losing the confidence of the investors who finance it. Before we can understand why America's debt keeps growing, we first need to understand what the national debt actually is. The national debt is the total amount of money the U.S. government has borrowed over time. Imagine the government collects $5 trillion in taxes this year, but it spends $6 trillion. That leaves a $1 trillion shortfall. To cover that shortfall, the government borrows $1 trillion by selling Treasury securities to investors. Over time, those annual deficits add up. That accumulated borrowing becomes the national debt. The budget deficit is the amount needed in a single year. The national debt is the total amount it still owes after years. But this leads to another important question. Who keeps lending trillions of dollars to the U.S. government every year? The U.S. government borrows money by selling Treasury securities. A Treasury security is essentially a loan to the U.S. government. Investors lend money to the government today. In return, the government promises to repay that money with interest at a future date. But who buys these Treasury securities? Many people believe China is America's biggest lender. In reality, most U.S. government debt is owned by American investors and institutions. Banks, pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and millions of individual investors all own Treasury securities. Foreign governments and overseas investors also buy them because U.S. Treasury securities are considered among the safest investments in the world. China is one of those investors, but it owns only a small share of America's total debt. The reason investors continue buying U.S. government debt is simple. They trust that the United States will repay them in full and on time. As long as that trust remains, the government can continue raising money by selling new Treasury securities. But what happens when those loans eventually come due? The answer is that, in most cases, it doesn't pay off its debt the way people imagine. Imagine you borrow $1,000 from a bank for 5 years. When those 5 years are over, you take out a new loan. You use the new loan to repay the old one. The original loan has been repaid, but a new loan has taken its place. The debt hasn't disappeared. It has simply been replaced. The U.S. government manages much of its debt in a similar way. When Treasury securities reach their maturity date, the government usually issues new Treasury securities. The money raised from those new investors is then used to repay the previous investors. This process is known as rolling over the debt. It has been a normal part of government finance for decades. As long as investors are willing to keep buying, the system continues to work. But if interest rates rise or they stop buying, the cost of borrowing rises and managing the debt becomes much more difficult. That leads to another important question. If the system has worked for decades, why does America's debt keep getting bigger? If the government can keep refinancing its debt, why does the national debt continue to grow? The government is not just refinancing old debt. It is also borrowing new money almost every year. For decades, the United States has generally spent more than it has collected in taxes. That gap is known as a budget deficit. To cover that deficit, the government has to borrow even more money. As a result, new debt is added on top of the existing debt. Several factors have contributed to these persistent deficits. Spending on programs such as Social Security, Medicare, and national defense has increased over time. At the same time, interest payments have become one of the fastest growing expenses in the federal budget. In other words, the government now has to borrow money not only to fund its programs, but also to help pay the interest on previous borrowing. That makes reducing the debt increasingly difficult. The national debt didn't become the world's largest because of a single crisis. It grew gradually, one budget deficit after another. But does having the world's largest debt automatically mean America is in danger? A large national debt does not automatically lead to a financial crisis. What matters is whether the country can continue managing it. One of the most important ways economists assess this is by comparing the national debt to the size of the economy. A larger economy generates more income, making it easier to support a larger amount of debt. Another key factor is the cost of borrowing. If investors are willing to lend money at relatively low interest rates, managing the debt becomes much easier. But if investors begin demanding higher returns, interest costs rise. That leaves the government with less money for other priorities and increases the need for even more borrowing. This is why many economists are less concerned about the size of the debt itself than the rate at which it is growing. If the economy continues growing and investors remain confident, the debt can remain manageable. But if debt grows much faster than the economy for many years, the financial pressure becomes increasingly difficult to manage. That brings us to the biggest question of all. Can this system continue indefinitely? The United States still has important advantages. It has the world's largest economy. The US dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency, and US Treasury securities are still among the most trusted investments in global financial markets. These advantages allow the United States to borrow on a scale that few other countries could sustain, but they do not eliminate the risks. If debt continues growing faster than the economy, interest payments will consume an increasing share of the federal budget. That leaves less money for public services, infrastructure, and future investments. It also makes responding to future recessions and financial crises more difficult. In the end, America's national debt is not simply about how much money the government owes. It is about whether the country can continue managing that debt while maintaining the confidence of investors. As long as that confidence remains, the system can continue to function. If that confidence weakens, borrowing becomes more expensive, financial pressure increases, the debt becomes much harder to manage. The story of America's national debt is ultimately not a story about debt, it is a story about confidence. Because in the global financial system, confidence is often more valuable than money itself. America's national debt will almost certainly continue to grow. The real question is whether the country's economy can continue growing with it. History has shown that governments can carry large amounts of debt for a very long time, but only as long as investors believe that debt remains manageable. That's why the future of America's national debt won't be determined by a single number. It will be determined by economic growth, responsible fiscal decisions, and the confidence of the people and institutions that continue financing it. In the end, the national debt is more than an economic statistic. It is a measure of how much confidence the world still has in the United States. And in finance, confidence is one of the few things that cannot be borrowed. Thank you for watching Financial Cycles. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for more insights into the global economy. See you in the next video.